Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be briefly discussing The Prestige, a film by Christopher Nolan that came out in, I believe, the 2000s. The interesting thing about this film and why I think it's underrated is that a lot of the time when people associate with Christopher Nolan, they think of the Batman series of films or Inception, but it seems like The Prestige gets a little bit overlooked. And that's kind of a reasoning for me for putting it in this underrated category. Is it a perfect film? For sure not, I'd say, because it is one of those films that you have to sort of be in the mood for to enjoy. This film really asks you to pay attention. It asks you to be invested. It asks you to kind of absorb what's going on. And it's almost like reading a book, this kind of movie. It's asking you to pay attention. And you have to pay attention in order to get it. And I think that's what makes it a little bit more, I guess, maybe complicated than something like Inception or Batman, where we kind of get the major concept of it. But with The Prestige, there is a major concept, but there's so many details to it that it's hard for people to maybe absorb everything that's going on. So that might be also another reason why people don't really look at this film as in a higher regard, I think. But regardless, I still think it's a good film, and I would recommend it to people. But in case you don't know what The Prestige is about, basically, without giving too much of the plot away, because this is a fairly plot-driven movie, Hugh Jackman, who plays Robert Angier, is rivaled with Christian Bale's character Alfred Borden, and these two characters are magicians. Get the two mixed up. Magicians. They're sort of 1800s magicians, probably more 19th century, later 1800s. Early 1900s magicians. It's not really specific as to the exact time period, but you can get a sense with like the costumes and a little bit that it is around those two centuries. And basically these two magicians are rivals because you'll kind of see how in the beginning there's certain events that happen within their lives, and it kind of ultimately gets to the point where they end up sort of blaming each other for their misfortunes. And you'll see this a lot with Hugh Jackman's character, and how at the beginning there's this tragic event that happens, and it results in him feeling like it's sort of Christian Bale's character's fault, and he has this kind of drive to sort of beat him in being a magician. So it's sort of played up to the idea that magicians want to try to find the latest, coolest trick that they could pull off. And basically you'll see how these two characters sort of develop their sort of rivalry throughout the film. I kind of like too how it gives like these fairly different characterizations between the two guys. Like we see how Hugh Jackman's character is not at all like Christian Bale's character. He's a completely different kind of magician, in that he's more, I guess, about show and is kind of more suave, I guess. Whereas Christian Bale is more about, I guess, the trick itself, and is trying to get an audience invested more in the trick than, I guess, his, presence. So again, we have two completely different characters, and at the same time they do kind of emphasize the point too that these characters are ultimately fairly flawed. And you'll see this throughout the film, and you'll kind of get a sense too that that even though maybe Christopher Nolan wants us to take a side between the two, he kind of tries to make it that not one guy is a really, really good guy and not one is really a bad guy. Even though you could make the argument that maybe we're supposed to see Hugh Jackman's character in a more negative light. It seems like he tries to balance the two, in that he gives them these traits that make them fairly likable, and then others that we kind of can kind of bring a cold shoulder to as an audience. So again, it is trying to, Christopher Nolan, I think, was doing a good job trying to establish like the dimension between the characters, and it's really established too in creating this kind of world of magic and sort of the smoke screens, and how people, you know, sort of manipulate people for entertainment purposes. And you'll kind of see how magic works and what these kinds of tricks are and what they involve, and how some of them can be really dangerous. And you'll kind of see how this affects the characters and affects the way their relationship is. So it really is revolved around this world and trying to create this very competition-driven world with all the different tricks that they can pull off. And the interesting thing too is that you usually think of magicians as like colorful, and you know, they're kind of associated with the circus. They have this very kind of happy like appeal, but this film is very bleak. There's almost, I want to say that there's a minimal amount of color. It's almost like a gray, similar to, as you can see by the bad quality of my camera, my webcam camera, that basically it creates this very kind of bleak world. You really do feel sort of a little bit miserable while you're watching it, because I think it does try to appeal to that Christopher Nolan dark style that he likes to do, which you'll probably see in a lot of other of his films. But it does seem like that he wants to build this world of competition, and having us look at these characters as these very flawed men who kind of try to find ways to outdo each other. And we ultimately see who wins. We ultimately see what ends up resulting from this kind of rivalry. And we kind of see a conclusion in that it's not like a good triumphs over evil type thing. It's more of like things happen in their own respects, but it's not like that everything is completely rosy. I think Christopher Nolan was trying to sort of emphasize that, and that their profession sort of drives their lives, and how that profession can really damage other people. And the interesting thing too is we can kind of see this, I think, too in today's world, where there's this thriving sense of we have to beat somebody else, and we have to outdo somebody else, and we have to go to whatever lengths to show that we're the better person. And I think Christopher Nolan was really trying to point out the flaw with this, and how it has consequences. So really, I think it brings that to light in both characters, even though we might sympathize again maybe more with Christian Bale than with Hugh Jackman. But at the same time, Hugh Jackman still has a lot of things within his character that has made him the way he is, and you kind of see that throughout the film. So again, it's really not trying to create a good guy versus bad guy scenario, and that it tries to make it a little bit more complex than that. And that's why I really admire this film for trying to do that. Instead of giving us we have Christian Bale, who's the goody two-shoes perfect man on this side, and then we have Hugh Jackman, who's just this evil conniving, mustache twirling villain. No, it's very it's a lot more darker and more complicated than that. And I like how Christopher Nolan sort of brings that out in the film. And you kind of see too, at least from the research that I pulled, it seems like he really did try to pick his actors carefully, and he did try to see if they would be invested. And I think that kind of depends too. You know, you will get some directors will pick actors, and then the actors not maybe invested so much in that role. But he really got people on board who were invested. You could tell Hugh Jackman was really trying to do a good job and gave off a very good performance. I think this is actually one of his better performances. There's also Christian Bale, who again you could argue is maybe a little bit more playing himself, but again he doesn't have any silly Batman voices, so don't worry about that. And he's not like overly angsty as maybe some of his other characters are, or overly egotistical like in American Psycho. And if you see that movie or even hear about that movie, which I've heard of, you'll kind of understand that point. But he plays a completely different character, and I think it pulls through well. But you will too see that he is not he's not really, I think, the character we're supposed to admire, but we're supposed to kind of look at these men more for their flaws rather than their virtues, and see what these flaws end up resulting in for them. You know, like how their obsession with their work and their obsession with trying to outdo each other and try to get ahead in the magician business really sort of destroys them and breaks them down. So you really will see that in the film, and I think it does a good job of that. And it's an interesting subject matter, I think, to talk about musicians magicians in such a way. Apologize if they're magicians, not musicians. Just those two words sound so similar. Why does the English language have words that sound so similar? But basically, what I mean to say is that they're magicians, not musicians. They're magicians, meaning they perform magic tricks and do magic stunts and try to get people thinking that what they're doing is real, even though it might be fake. And the interesting thing too is we kind of really don't know what to believe at the end. It tries to sort of play with your emotions, and it gets you thinking, I think, too. And I think if a movie can get you thinking, it's doing something productive, and it's giving you something to talk about. And I think even the first time when I saw it, when I was a little younger, I didn't think I appreciated it as much because this movie is slow. It has that kind of Christopher Nolan style of being sometimes slow, in that not a lot is maybe happening, but it's more of the context of what is happening that makes it effective, and that what brings everything sort of together towards the end. So again, I think if coming from a younger audience's perspective, it may not strike a chord, but if you like these kinds of films, if you do like Christopher Nolan, I think you'll like this film. I think it does a good job of trying to create characters. There's also Scarlett Johansson actually is in this movie too, and she plays Olivia Wenscombe, and basically she's the assistant to Robert Englund, Hugh Jackman's character, and you'll kind of see how they develop this kind of relationship and how it's sort of tested with when Christian Bale's character comes in, Alfred Borden. So really you do see the kind of misery that it is. It almost reminded me too of in a similar light to True Grit, the newer one. with the dude in it. And by the dude I mean Jeff Bridges. But basically, you do get this kind of bleak sense of how this rivalry sort of, destroys your life. Similar to in True Grit at the end, when the girl comes back years later and looks at the grave of the guy that she killed and doesn't really feel anything out of it, and doesn't get a real sense of closure. It's almost like it didn't provide anything for her to begin with, and how it doesn't really ultimately mean anything. So again, it's kind of, I think, has that similar feel going for it, and that like how rivalry and the idea of sort of revenge sort of destroys people. And I think this movie was trying to play that out, and plays it fairly effectively, and I think realistically as well. So, for the most part, I think that's ultimately all I can say about it without giving anything really away. But again, this is a kind of a movie where you'll have to pay attention. You can't just sit there and expect it all to be clearly mapped out for you. You're going to have to, kind of sit there and watch it. And even though at times, yes, it does go slow, what ultimately it's saying, I think, works really well. But that's really ultimately all I think I can say about this film as a whole. But again, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But until next time, everybody, bye-bye.